There's a place for us somewhere, a place for us.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Cora Cervantes, Associate Producer at MSNBC and NBC News. Thanks so much for joining our session about raising the bar on LGBTQ plus issues. So I'll go ahead and kick things off by introducing our panelists one by one, so if you can join us. I'll kick things off with John Paul Bramer, also known as JP Bramer, aka Hola Papi, a writer, illustrator, and a recently published author. Thank you so much for joining us, JP.
Thank you for having me.
And next, I'd like to invite David Artavia, reporting for Yahoo Entertainment and Yahoo Live, former editor-in-chief of Out Magazine and The Advocate Magazine. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Great to see you, Cora.
Likewise. So last but certainly not least, it's a pleasure to introduce Bambi Salcedo, president of the Trans Latino Coalition, an advocate, motivational speaker, presenter, community organizer, taking her trans visibility to a lot of places, including the White House most recently. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Muchas gracias.
So to kick things off, the title is interesting to me, right? Raising the bar. And I always say, as a queer Latina, when we talk about, issues within our community, there's a bar, but it's set really low and we gotta raise it by a lot. There's so much work to do. And so I'm glad to have you all here because that's what I want to talk about. How do we do that? How have you been raising that bar thus far within the work that you all do, whether it's through magazine, through writing for books or social media, and, Bambi, in your case, through policymaking, advocacy, and grassroots organizing. So what does that look like, especially in journalism, right? Which is a place where you got to get the story right. So I'll kick things off, if it's okay, just to set the tone from the issues and where we at in terms of policy and the state of this. Bambi, if you can share with us, I know you recently went to the White House, and what was particularly interesting to me about it is a couple of years ago, we had a Pride celebration there, and there was a call out when it came to the detention of trans migrants in the community. And we've moved there since then. A lot of the work that your organization has done has been to raise awareness about what it's like for our trans brothers and sisters in detention, and just overall a lot of these issues. So can you share with us a little bit about, one, what your experience was like, what issues you see presently at the forefront, and what are we missing that we should be talking about?
Well, primero que nada, yo quiero darle gracias a mi creador, mi poder superior, por darme la oportunidad de estar aquí con ustedes y también, obviamente, saludar a la gente que nos acompaña hoy en día. I know that it was probably hard for some of you to understand what I just said, but I always give gratitude to my creator, my higher power, for giving me the opportunity to breathe one more day. But I also want to honor the beautiful and amazing people who are joining us today. And certainly, the amazing and beautiful people from NIHJ for giving me the opportunity to be here and share space with all of you. let me just start with your first question, which was, the fact that I was able to be invited to the White House with this administration, right? So as a Latina, trans, undocumented woman, right? It's certainly historic, right? Because um, you know the White House, particularly, right, is not a space that is necessarily designed for people like myself, right? Someone who has been incarcerated for uh, about 14 years of my life in and out of prison, um, and everything else, right, that I have survived. And so, you know, it's truly historic, for myself and for our community, uh, for me to be invited and to really represent one of the populations that is most marginalized, even within the LGBTQ community. Um, and you mentioned the incident that happened in 2015, right? When you know my sister, Genest Gutierrez, really called out, right, the administration for the incarceration and caging of uh, trans people specifically, right? We know that trans people who are incarcerated particularly experience inhumane treatment in many different ways. There are cases of trans women who have been actually murdered by the system, by the carceral system. And so we definitely want to change that, right? It's not fair that many of us leave our countries running away from the violence that we experience, um, only to come to a place to where we think that we're gonna be supported to be incarcerated simply because we're trying to save our lives, right? And so, um, and not only that, but also once we are in there, we're also abused and not treated with dignity and respect, and really in a humane way. And so, we certainly, are calling to end of trans detention through different efforts. And so, you know, one of the things that we also just did, recently, less than 2 weeks ago, we had a campaign to free Maura, who Maura was a trans woman who had been in immigration detention for over 2 years. And so, we want that, right? She's out in our community. She's, doing her best to thrive, and we're supporting her to the best of our ability as well. And so, all of those things are important through the work that we do. And I also want to highlight, that just yesterday, for instance, through the work that we do, um, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, uh, signed a budget, the state budget yesterday, and in that budget um, there's a line item that $13 million are going to be included um, through the Transgender Wellness and Equity Fund, which is Assembly Bill 2218. So we made history through that in the state of California. But we also, as a state, we also made history, really sending a message of the importance of investing in trans lives. So hashtag trans life, invest in trans lives. And this is the work that we do, and for me, as the president and the CEO of the Trans Latino Coalition, it's not just an honor, but I'm just humbly grateful that we get to do this work and do this work in coalition with many other organizations and individuals.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Bambi. Yeah, it was so interesting to see through social media the way you documented your visit, especially in relation to, you shared, 2015, and a lot of conversations we've had about, about the trans community, and just what we know, how to engage, how to humanize the experience, and how to talk about policy making, right, at the federal and state level. And so, noting those editorial choices, Avida, I'm gonna head over to you and just ask you, based on the role that you've played in the publications that you've worked for and that you're working with, about your editorial lens, the choices that you're making to cover issues like the ones that Bambi has spoken about. What hurdles have you faced in covering these issues, and How do you raise the bar?
Well, first of all, I just have to applaud Bambi for the work that she does, because, oftentimes journalists like myself, uh, while we work really hard trying to get all of the facts and all of the leave no stone unturned when we're covering these issues, at the end of the day, we're just writing about them, whereas Bambi is actually on the ground doing it. So while it's an incredible honor to, be a queer journalist, a Latino queer journalist in today's landscape, especially, and there's a lot of responsibility around that. It's the people like Bambi who are really making these changes. So I just wanted to applaud her because I'm a huge follower of her work and I admire her tremendously. But I was really proud to one of my last issues at Out Magazine before I transitioned to Yahoo, where I'm at now, was a cover story dealing with a 9-month-long investigation into the Colombian refugee crisis, which is the biggest humanitarian disaster facing Latino America in recent history. And it was a doozy of a story. And, whenever I always say when we as Latino journalists are covering these issues that are very important, it's so important not just to tackle the what, but also why. Why are we here? How did we get here? Giving that full understanding picture of how we got to this place, because context always matters. It's important to point out that Latino people still face incredible barriers in healthcare, not just because of social and cultural bias and discrimination, but also because of there are language barriers that health departments aren't investing in. There are real things that could be solved tomorrow that people aren't paying attention to. There are, I'm sure all of us can have agree in some way or another that there are, as the Latino community, we still have some cultural wars that we're facing. Mexicans don't like El Salvadorians, Cubans don't like Brazilians. And yes, it's kind of funny to talk about that, but at the end of the day, it's important to unpack that as well, and to really understand that, a issue is all of our issues because we're all facing the same dilemmas. So in terms of choices of how, we cover these issues, it's always important to, first of all, elevate the voices of the people that are really making the changes, because oftentimes what I found in the last year during the pandemic is a lot of people tended to feel like they weren't doing enough, because they saw what was street, they saw what was happening on Twitter, they saw all of this, and they felt like they weren't doing enough. To which I say, everyone has a lane in the movement, right? Not all of us are natural born speakers. Not all of us are natural born speech writers. Not all of us are natural born organizers or protesters or, whatever. I choose to, my lane is I'm an editor and I'm a writer and I am blessed to have this platform. So how can I elevate voices of the people who are really making this change and publish their work and really spotlight the issues that are happening? Because I don't have time to go on the street, frankly. I'm at my desk constantly. And there are other people who feel the same way too. But there are also ways that you can go around it. If you're a small business owner, how can you donate your space? How can you donate your products to help the cause? Or if you're happen to be a graphic designer of some kind that's not working right now, how can you donate your time and your talent to the movement? We all have a role to play. It's important to show up for sure, but it's also important to really drive that message, because there are a lot of people who feel like they're not doing enough because they're not on the streets marching because they have a million jobs, and that's okay too. We all have a role to play, but it's about finding that and raising the bar. There are a lot of negative stories out there about Latino people. I think one of the best ways that we can do it, raising our bar, is to really tap into the Latino joy, because there's so much joy. in our community. We have to balance that. You know, I'm a firm believer that life imitates art in many ways. And as, you know, we've gotten more visibility and representation in television and in film, it's interesting to see how that plays into society. So we need to start putting out good representations of Latino people, not just the hot-tempered husband, you know, the Latino lover, the gangbanger, and all of these things that we see all over television, including, you know, Law and Order. But, you know, GLAAD just released a study that's, I think, releasing tomorrow, where they found there were 0 trans non-binary characters counted in major film studios. That's not television, but major film studios. There were also 0 LGBTQ characters living with HIV in films, 0 LGBTQ characters with a disability. So I, as an editor and as a writer, I always see that as a challenge. How can we dare Hollywood? How can we dare people to start to tell our stories in an authentic way? Because it can't help but bleed into culture, you know? So I think it's a responsibility that we all have, and it must be embraced with a real intention and support.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And I think this is a good segue to, you know, a lot of the space that you operate in, JP. Like, you know, we talk about identities and the intersection of that, but also the intersection of platforms and spaces. And so you exist in the work that you do exists in a really interesting place, which is, one, the writing that you do, the place that it has within, you know, print, you know, whether it's your book or, you know, your advice column, all that puppy, but it's also your audience, you know, on social media. And so thinking about, you know, Bambi's experience, what David has shared, for you, you know, can you share a little bit about that unique space that you've cultivated through the years, and how you bridge your content with your audience, and how you raise the bar in terms of LGBTQ issues, and how you cover them and engage with them?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to start, it's such an honor to be here with Bambi and David, and it is so refreshing to hear Genest's name particularly. That's a hero of mine, so I love every time that she gets her shine. I guess I would start by saying, you know, the course to what I'm doing right now has been very winding. You know, we used to work together in NBC News, where I did a lot of reporting for both the Latino and LGBT section. And nowadays, I'm very much doing my own thing as an author, kind of, but still trying to incorporate an element of reporting into what I do. So in my book that recently came out, Hola Papi, based on my online advice column of the same name, I have a chapter about working in a tortilla factory, because growing up in a rural environment where I was sort of estranged from my community, I felt the urge to sort of be a real Mexican and learn our family traditions and our language that my family had lost because they struggled with it so much. You know, my abuela dropped out of elementary school to pick fruit for a living, and my abuelo was the very first in his entire family to get a higher education, something that sort of estranged him from the rest of his family members. So while in the tortilla factory, I wrote about a lot of different experiences, including my own, but also just being around people who, even though we're all housed under the Latino umbrella, we have different experiences. I was working with people who were undocumented, people from different countries and cultures that I hadn't even considered at that young age, because, you know, when you're growing up, especially the way I did in so much isolation, I was like, okay, everyone's either Mexican or they're not Mexican. And it was sort of about opening my eyes to what the world was really about. But I think that that chapter also has a lot to say about the landscape that we all sort of navigate. We can all probably relate to, be it in the media world or in the organizing world, and that is just how difficult it can be to maintain the bridges between all these disparate experiences. So, you know, for me, yes, I have that family immigrant narrative. I have the family that sort of grew up in poverty and wanted to assimilate really badly, and really wanted to have their children and their children's children live an quote unquote easier life. And the way they sort of approached that was to assimilate. And I think that that is very much a strong undercurrent of a lot of the tensions that we experience when we're trying to put everyone under one roof, you know, because there are a lot of people who aren't able to assimilate. There are a lot of people who, even if they, you know, speak English, there is something about them that makes them fall into the other. And it is a very dangerous time in the world we live in right now to be the other. And so what I try to do with my work is I really try to say, hey, you know, I don't have all the answers. I'm not able to speak for everyone, But I know that if I'm able to portray my experience as I know it, with all its nuances, all its blemishes, if I have my little piece of the mosaic that I can sort of show to everyone without any shame or without feeling like I have to hide it, someone's going to be able to see themselves in it, and it'll make them maybe reflect on, everything that is unique about their own perspective, everything that makes their life a different shape, a different color. And I think that's where my abilities sort of begin and end, and I'm sort of at peace with that because I'm not doing a lot of the work that some of my heroes are doing, but I really do enjoy putting my perspective out there in the way that I do because I think it's important. I think we need a surplus of stories if we're ever going to be able to find equal footing and representation in the landscape that we're in today.
A surplus of stories. I like that. Thank you so much for sharing, your experience and how you bridge those spaces. And I'm gonna come back to you, Bambi. And if you can share, I was really intrigued by that, a comment you made, JP, about the landscapes we navigate and how we maintain these bridges between these experiences. Also to David's point, right, about different identities and how we work on that. So Bambi, in your case, how do you bridge these experiences and identities? And what are we missing as journalists as we cover these experiences? What do you see that's not there that we should be looking at?
Yeah. So, thank you really to all three of you because your work is super integral into really changing the narrative, right, of our community. And so I want to express my appreciation for all and everything that you do. I always refer to myself as, yo siempre digo que yo soy un milagro, right? Like I am a miracle, right? But I also, always say that I am a community investment, right? In fact, my definition of a CEO for me and towards me, right, it's I am a community elevated officer, right? Because it has been the community and people such as yourselves, right, who has uplifted me to be who I am today, right? Because, you know, um, I've been doing community work for like almost 25 years, right? And so, prior to that, right, like the way I was navigating the world was that it was very negatively, right? Um, in fact, when I started my transition, back in the 80s, right, like there was no resources for us. There was, everything and anything that we needed, like we would find within community on the streets, right? And so, you know, through the fight that we have fought, right? And also through the elevation by people who really create those stories, right? That really paint a picture of the work that we're doing, but who we are also as people, right? It has, it's incredible, but I think there also needs to be done more in terms of, how we like how and who we put out there, right? Because the media has sort of like glamorized, right? Like trans people, right? Like, yes, it is true that in the last 5 years there has been more visibility in the media about trans people. We're in magazines, we're in TV shows, we're in different places, right? But that doesn't necessarily paint the picture of many members of our community, right? Like there's a group of people who are being uplifted and highlighted, and I may include myself in that, right? But there are so many different stories, right? Like, like the story of Maura, for instance, right? Like, um, who, you know, like her story has not been told, right? And so there are so many different people who come and access services here with us, right? Like who have incredible stories, and I'm so happy that through the leadership of Alberto Mendoza, who was the previous executive director of NAHJ, right? That we got funding to highlight the stories of 25 trans, women who have crossed borders, right? And so um, I'm so like incredible grateful for that, right? Because we have to obviously rely on the people who have the ability to support for us to also tell our own stories, right? Um, and so I'm just like, really grateful that we are able to do that work, that we're able to do that work in collaboration with individuals such as yourselves, right? Because, it's important that we get it, right? Like, it's important that we get, like, how it was said, right? By David, that, we don't just tell the lives and the stories of our people like on a like victimizing way, but rather on a, you know, uplifting and highlighting, right? Like our resiliency and our joy, right? And um, so I'm, how I navigate the world now is obviously very different than how I navigated spaces before. But even then, as a privileged trans woman, right? Like, um, I also feel and see the marginalization within different spaces, right? But the difference is, that I am in power and I get to speak, right, for my community. But many members of our community need to also have the ability to do that.
And thank you for sharing that, Bambi. Just to share a brief anecdote, about 2 years ago, we had an event at NBC at 30 Rock, where we invited a lot of Latinos to come in to meet producers, senior producers, executive producers, and we had a panel, and Alberto Mendoza was executive director at the time, said, Bambi Salcedo's here in New York. Do you have anyone speaking about, trans Latina experience? And I said, we don't, but she should be in the room. And it really, for me, it brought home the importance of really asking ourselves, who isn't in the room, whose story isn't being told, who are we interviewing, why is this important, that why is so huge. And so, there's a lot of examples of how we get it wrong, but there are some really wonderful examples of when we get it right. And so, to Bambi, to your point about joy and resilience, it reminds me of David's earlier point about how do we celebrate that. And so, David, if you can share with us a story that stood out for you, where you felt like you got it right and you really spoke to the joy that exists within the LGBTQ plus community.
Oh wow! And if we're all giving shout outs to Alberto, hi Alberto, I love him. But yeah, it's so important. We always talk about how Latinos aren't we're not a monolith, right? When we say the same thing about the LGBTQ plus community too, and it's so important because it is important to have a representative in the room, because if we don't, we are going to miss stories. And and I hate to say it, but coming from a niche publication to corporate media, and I'm so thankful for Yahoo, because this year is the first year that they're doing a fellowship with NAHJ, which is part of the reason why I'm at Yahoo. And I applaud them for that. And I wish more corporate media companies did the same, because it's really about, making sure that we're not missing any one voice. And to Bambi's point, there are the glamorizing a certain subset of the trans community, a certain subset of the Latino community is not doing the larger community the service that we want, and as journalists, sometimes we're the only Latino voice in the newsroom. And, I hate to say it, but sometimes we do have to have that pressure on ourselves to fight for what we know is right. One example I can think of is I recently wrote a big In the Heights feature for Yahoo about the film, and interviewed Maria Hinojosa and Javier Munoz and a couple other really stellar people for the piece. And, it's something that, I wanted to focus on the Latino joy of the film. And something happened whenever I was pitching that story where I thought, where someone asked me, well, what is Latino joy? Can you explain it to me? And I thought to myself, oh, okay, interesting. And, I thought it was a great thing that they asked me that, first of all. And it's the purpose of that whole piece was to highlight the Latino joy that the movie conveyed. And, you know, obviously there was a lot of aftermath after the film came about, Colorism, which was a very righteous argument. But, you know, I think it really opened my eyes in terms of what has been missing on a corporate level in terms of like the focus of telling Latino stories. Because, you know, speaking about the nuances of imposter syndrome, which is something a lot of Latino people face in the newsroom, speaking about the very specific experience of being a first generation immigrant like myself. My dad came from Costa Rica when he was 17. He didn't speak any English. He actually learned English while he was serving in the US military. But, you know, unfortunately, he never taught me and my sister Spanish because he was of that generation that thought he wanted to raise American children and he thought he was doing us a service. And there are a lot of people who have that story here in America. And they have a voice too. I find it so interesting that in many cases, the Latino journalists that I have been speaking to, this new generation is really the one that's pressuring companies more so than ever. And I think it's fascinating because as the children of immigrants, you know, we're really trying to step into the dream that our parents and our grandparents had for us. So in terms of covering LGBTQ issues, I think it really is about really focusing on what is missing, you know, what is this elements that are missing in terms of this, because we have to speak up. If we don't speak up, no one else will. And sometimes it's a lonely place to be, but it just has to be done. And for those watching who are in the same position, I completely understand what you're going through. But at the end of the day, there is a community around you that will rally with you. So don't ever be afraid to speak out about those things. Because just one more point to say about that, the Latino stories and Latino communities are bankable. We've already proven that. And, you know, a study just came out this week that 36% of US Latinos have listened to a podcast in the last month. That's and there's been a 44% increase of that since last year. So Latinos are really listening to podcasts. They are on their phone. They are listening to TikToks, and advertisers are finally paying attention to that. So that is where we can find our power, you know? And I think it's incumbent upon us to step into that power.
Thanks for that. I appreciate the last comment, especially. And so one of the things you touched on is just the idea of, you know, young professionals or people starting out and just where we are at. You know, JP, I remember you from your time in NBC, and you wrote some really cool stories for NBCL and NBC Latino. Both have two amazing managing editors, you know, Brooke and Sandra, who really do, you know, much like David, really push to get the story right. And there's that editor lens, right? But then there's also the writers. In terms of pitching, what advice do you have for young professionals that are passionate about stories that exist at the intersection of LGBTQ issues, Latino issues, and beyond, to get their stories out there, you know, in spaces like NBC, but also the fact that you've been able to publish your work in a lot of different spaces and in different forms. So what advice do you have?
Yeah, I guess I would start by saying that when it comes to journalism, we are still very much living in a system of the quote unquote star reporter, where it's just like there's this one guy, it's always a guy, and he tends to be white, he tends to be cisgender and straight. And it tends to be the case that a lot of news outlets put a lot of their resources into that one person. It's the sort of case of the individual, and they get to sort of do whatever they want. But for the rest of us, it's not really so. And so what I would say to anyone who comes from a marginalized background in the newsroom and wants to get some stories told is that no, you actually can't do it alone, but that is also a strength. It is something that you can rely on. So for me, one thing that working at NBC and all these other outlets that I've worked at really brought into stark relief is that community knowledge is really important. And knowing people in your community, the people whose stories that you are directly responsible for telling, is so important, because a lot of my stories came from just existing in those spaces and hearing what people were talking to me about like, Why aren't we covering this? Why is this thing happening and no one's speaking on it? Why is it so hard to get people to care about this issue that's affecting this section of the community? All those story ideas came because I had a community that trusted me. I was an active member of it. I was a collaborator in it. And they were able to connect me with people who could talk to me on the record and people who could actually say, here's my expertise on this. Here is some information that you maybe didn't have on this. And that is invaluable when you are fighting for stories to get told in a corporate newsroom, because a lot of them will end up getting shot down, but that just means you have to have two other ideas in your back pocket that you're willing to go to the bat for. And I wouldn't ever say it's fair. And I will say it's an uphill battle, but it is very rewarding. And it is literally you changing the very fabric of a newsroom, which, as we've all learned over the past few years, is incredibly, incredibly important, because that does sort of set the tone and set the agenda for a lot of people. So if you're able to go into, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be NBC or a big corporation, it can be a smaller platform thing. But if you are using a platform, if you are amplifying voices, that is such an important job to hold. And I tend to think of it more as a community role rather than just a job. It is something that people are trusting you to do. You are directly accountable to this group of people. You don't ever want to betray their trust. You want to make sure that you are known for being trustworthy with their stories. And that is going to reward you tenfold over the course of your career. And even me, who doesn't really write a whole lot of articles anymore, I saw my book the same way. I see a lot of my projects the same way. I think of it as I have an opportunity to not just tell my story, but maybe let someone else know that their story is also something that could be a book, that could be a movie, that could exist in the world in some way that other people are going to see it. That's a very sacred thing for me. So yeah, my advice would be to make sure you have your community in mind and that you are a member of it. You are not the spokesperson for it. You are a member of it. I think that's really important.
Not a spokesperson, but a member.
Yeah.
Good point.
Collaborator.
Member. So we have questions from our audience. Diana Ramos asks, LGBTQ plus community. The LGBTQ plus community is still a taboo in the Latino community. So how can Latino journalists promote these types of stories, and how do we deal with it, right? So I guess there's two layers. I think one, there's the taboo piece, right, that is still very real. So and then there's the how do we promote these types of stories. So Bambi, I'm gonna go to you first if you can speak to how you tackled it as a taboo, and then David, given your editorial lens, then if you can share with us how to promote these stories.
So so the question is how do you promote the stories of our people, right?
And how do you like a lot of issues in our community is still very much taboo. So even engaging with them, is tricky depending on the generation, the background, etc. But that doesn't mean that there isn't space, right? So it's what spaces have you found to bridge those gaps?
So I think. Well, I think there's two parts to it, right? Because as just JP was saying, right? There is the part that we play in this story, right? But also the part that the whoever's writing the story or the journalist play in it, right? And so, in my particular case, right? Like I have always been open about who I am and my experience, and of everything, right? Like prison, sex work, homelessness, drug addiction, like all of the things that have, impacted my life, right? Like I have been able to turn the shame of it into being able to be truthful, right? Because I think that it's, that has power in it, right? And so that has been obviously beneficial, but at the same time, the other part of it, right? Like the people who I have trusted with my story, which is this, also for other people, right? It's oftentimes hard to trust, because even in my case, I have, shared some of that to some people, and what happens oftentimes is that, many journalists, right? Like they only get bits and pieces that are going to create, um, sensation, right? Like it like they sensationalize a lot the stories of people, right? And so that's why, I super love what JP just said, right? Like I think we have to obviously um, put ourselves in other people's shoes, right? And how through you know writing stories or putting stories out there of people, right? Like um, it could be like a double-edged sword, right? It could be um, a benefit, or it could also impact people in a broader community for that matter, right? And so when we portray people in a particular way, that sort of like paints a picture not just of the individual, but through that individual also you know paints a picture of a whole community, right? And so um, it's important that one, we work together and that we obviously agree on what is going to be put out there, and so that we can support each other through that process, right? I know that JP talked about some of those challenges, but there are other mediums that we can also support to amplify, people's work as well.
David, before you jump in, I just want to say, Bambi just said something. There are a lot of mediums to amplify voices. Let me see if I do it right now. Wrong finger there. Palabra. That's an excellent space. I got an opportunity to write a piece about trans migrants' experience at detention center amid COVID, and a lot of other people have gone through that space. So thank you for having me. I'm really bad at this pointing thing, but yes, palabra. I didn't know you to. So David, if you can jump in, I know you had some points from an editorial standpoint about, how do we, promote these stories, break these taboos. Thanks so much for your insight, Bambi.
Yeah, it's so funny because this is kind of the dance, right? When when you're working in editorial, like how can we build empathy? How can we educate people who we're not just preaching to the choir, right? Like it's when you're working at a niche publication, there are several things that are incredibly valuable. First of all, your audience finds you, so working at a publication like Out and The Advocate, for example, which are, the top LGBTQ publications in America, arguably, advertisers who are trying to invest in these communities and they want to target a certain consumer. They know to come to these publications because they know that the people that they're targeting to see their product or whatever, their show or whatever they're promoting, they're going to see it. So, and going back to what I said before, therein lies our power. But in terms of like spreading our mission to elevate our stories, there are so many backdoors. Like I think one of the most powerful thing is to tap into our commonalities. And by that, I mean, just one example, I'm working on a story right now at Yahoo about single gay dads and elevating single gay dads who are, nailing fatherhood, and all of them sort of came to single parenthood in various different forms. But Jose Rolon, he is a TikTok star, a Puerto Rican TikTok star. He's a single gay dad with 3 kids, and he does really, really funny videos on TikTok with his kids, and they're adorable. And they're all super sweet, funny, adorable. He lives in New York, but his videos have gone viral, and he's gotten into shows like The Today Show and Ellen and Tamron Hall, and he was on the cover of Parenting Latina magazine when he was the first gay parent to be on that cover. But if you break that down just a little bit, the idea of parenting, a lot of people relate to parenting. So just seeing how he does it it makes his experience as a gay Latino not just a window, but a door into his experience using the commonality of parenting, and there are other different categories that fall in line with that same idea, like caretaking or healthcare, or, all these experiences that we face as a lifestyle category, just in terms of a lifestyle category, that we're all as human beings are interested in, but coming at it through a queer Latino lens does wonders because, SEO is a real thing. People Google. I think everyone knows that LGBTQ people, we Google, let's face it, we're Googlers. And tapping into those commonalities are so important because it shows the human side of us. It humanizes our experiences and not just sensationalizes us as a, as a Latino thing, but also invites people in to our lives. So that's incredibly powerful, as coming at it from the storytelling component rather than just using the keywords like Latino and queer for clickbait, but really focusing on the story, because the stories is where we really get the connection. And that's always the key.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm going to put you all on the spot a little bit because I really appreciated your point about content creation and it really being a good space to find stories that other content creators are putting out there. Obviously sourcing for news takes different forms, right? Whether it's people going to different events, staying in touch with their sources, going online to different spaces, and so on and so forth. So I guess I'll start with you, JP. If you can share, in terms of the different spaces that you use for sourcing, say, for example, social media, let's say, who are some people that stand out to you that have stories that you think would be like a good space for journalists to jump into and explore?
Ooh, do you mean like Latino Twitter or?
Is Latino Twitter a thing? And also, is there a layer that speaks to, like, queer Latinos that are engaging in that space? Is it like, are there people that stand out to you that you think, we should be following or looking to in terms of stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Twitter is very much a double-edged sword in as much as I get so much out of it. I learn perspectives that I never would have gotten otherwise. It can also really wreck your brain like it has for me. But I will say, for a beginning journalist or writer, it is a wonderful place because I actually used Twitter to launch my career when I was living in rural Oklahoma. My very first article came out in Huffington Post Latino. I reached out to Roque Planas, who was editing the Latino stories there, and I was just like fresh out of college, didn't have any connections, couldn't afford an internship. I just tweeted at him. I was just like, "Hey, I have a story idea. Can you maybe like take a look?" And he was like, "Sure." So I think that there are a lot of Latino people who are willing to help each other out, especially if you're just beginning, coming back to relying on community in that way. Even if we didn't know each other, someone extended that hand to me and it was super important. So even to this day, I use Twitter quite a bit just to hear from voices that I haven't ordinarily heard from in the past. But just be careful with it. Be very careful with all social media. It can get scary.
Very true. Very fast too. Well, I guess before I jump, I'm going to ask you, Bambi, as well, if you could think of some folks. And in the interim, I just want to say, NHJ has a cultural competency guide where it's not necessarily a place for sourcing, but it can give journalists a really good tools to know how to cover certain stories, from the use of pronouns to engaging with identity, dead names, to just the way that we can ask questions from a place of empathy and professionalism. So you can check it out. I just want to put it out there because I think it's a really cool tool, as well as obviously Human Rights Watch and GLAAD. They also have some great recommendations about how to report on the LGBTQ community. So Bambi, I'll go to you next. What are some people or accounts that stand out to you? I know I look at where you're at all the time. It's, where is Bambi? Where in the world is Bambi? Because you're doing so much. Who are people that you engage with or that you follow that you think us journalists should be looking at, so that we can learn a bit more about the different layers of our community and what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's only, the beautiful and amazing people who are here, right? Like, I mean, just the fact that I am able to share a stage with all of you, it's definitely, I'm super honored and grateful. So certainly I know that I can email you and call on you and, and you'll hear what I have to say. And so I am very appreciative of that. But I think just in general, I think we need to, for me particularly, right? And again, I am a privileged trans woman, right? That have different connections and different access, right? But even then, I am still limited to have access to journalists, right? Like, and so I think I'm just, it's sort of like going back to what I said earlier, right? I think it's sort of like a two-way street, if you will, right? Like I I want for people who are like in this world, if you will, right? Like in the world of journalism, right? To obviously support us as an organization, right? And us as a community, right? And so, um, having access, but then not having access, actually, it also, I think it's, I would want to encourage other people to also reach out to me, to people in our organization. I'm super, I know a lot of people, right? Like across the United States and even across, the world, right? And so I can certainly make connections. I can certainly support people in whatever they're thinking on doing. And and I think it's really about bouncing ideas. It really is about how do we work together to make this happen, right? And so um, I want to have more connections with people in media, right? I mean, I think for us as an organization, as we are growing, right, like we're not a big organization, right? But we are a small but mighty and badass organization, right? Because we do like amazing work, right? But we recently have contracted a person who is helping us do communications, right? Because like I can't do everything, right? And so I think through that, hopefully, we are going to be able to increase not just our visibility, but also to make connections with other people, particularly journalists and people who are like in media. Um, and so, that's sort of like the direction that we're going. And but also, again, I think it's it's a responsibility of both, right? Like people who have the ability to do that and the access, and us who also have connections to a community.
Thank you for sharing that. Actually, we have a question from NHJ's interim executive director, the amazing Sita Rocha, who I had the pleasure of meeting out in UTEP a couple years ago. So Zita asked, during the Trump years, did you experience an increase of discrimination, prejudice, aggression against the LGBTQ community? And I'll add a little piece to Zita's question and ask, how did you navigate that? So we'll start with JP, and then I'll toss to David, and then Bambi, you can share your experience.
Oh, well, yeah, I certainly did. I guess the most prominent memory is covering the taco trucks on every corner comment for The Guardian. And when I wrote about that, there was a headline written about me from this white supremacist news organization that was like, Mestizo F-word journalist John Paul Bramer hates white America. And there was this little like harassment campaign leveled against me just because I was making fun of this person for making the taco trucks in every corner remark. So that was very much for me a hallmark of the Trump years, just sort of being afraid of publishing things and wondering if there's going to be some sort of collective hate or resistance to it. But also I would say there were a lot of well-meaning people as well who sort of approached with a kind of weird reductionist lens to where every time Trump did something really bad that was bad for Latinos, I would get an email in my inbox from someone with a pitch being like, oh, do you want to like condemn this for our news outlets? And they had sort of pre-written my take for me, kind of because they were looking for like the outraged Mexican to say something for them. And it was like, you clearly don't trust my own thoughts and opinions on this. You already kind of put in what you want me to say. So from all sides, certainly it was the case. It just wasn't all from right-wing trolls. Some of it seeped into places that you wouldn't expect. But yeah, managing those years taught me a lot in terms of ways to keep myself protected from harassment campaigns, from people's less than savory thoughts, never read the comments, etc.
David, if you can share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar experience that as JP. I mean, obviously, during the Trump years, we saw a huge spike in rage clicks. People love to share their rage. They like to write about it. They like to, you know, and anything with a Trump headline did bonker traffic. And it was tough living in those years, especially as the pandemic started to happen, and more LGBTQ journalists were getting laid off. I mean, there was a whole series of people that were companies that were laying off LGBTQ people. I mean, we were typically almost the first to go almost every time, which was terrifying for a lot of us, because we were all sort of waiting on like, when is it going to be me next? Is it going to be me? So that obviously built a lot of anxiety for us. I mean, I remember I happened to live in West Hollywood where the first riot started happening with the George Floyd protests, and I went out to record it and to do some coverage, and someone spit on me on my phone when I was filming, and that had never happened to me before, and it was just an eye opener, if anything, to how tremendously uh, divided we can be as a country. Obviously, our democracy was under tremendous threat, and thankfully it didn't cave to these hateful people. But it's hard to write stories that giving an opinion about anything these days. People are scared to do that because there's so much response that is so negative. And there was a period where a lot of journalists didn't want to write about their opinions on Twitter because of that reason. I think we're nearing the end of that, thankfully. But yeah, it's hard dealing with this. Yes, to answer your question, yes, I did experience it. We got through it, thankfully, and it makes us stronger, I think, as journalists, because facts are often divisive because they're facts.
And so I just want to note, it's almost time for session 10, but I want to make sure, Bambi, you share. We have one more question, but if you could share with us what it was like for you and the community you work with under the Trump administration. Seems like such a good question to ask.
Yeah. I mean, I think, for me and for us as a community, right? Like, I think many people think that, that when Trump got into office, right, that, the issues like started, right? And that's not necessarily true, right? Like, I think the issues were amplified, right? But for many trans people, right, I think it's important, one, that we understand where trans people is, like, even now situated within our society, right? Like, trans people have experienced so much institutional violence, right, from multiple institutions, right, like our government, our churches, our schools, all of those, right? And so I think for us and for me as an organization, right, it was also an opportunity for us to continue to fight, right, and to be more vocal and to go continue to be on the streets, right, particularly when these attacks started happening specifically against our community, right, like reversing or denying healthcare services, right, like specifically for trans people, or banning people to serve, right, and the military, and just this multiple specific attacks towards trans people, right, that were very in your face type of thing, but those are things that have always existed, right? And so for us, it really is, how do we continue to organize, right? How do we continue to strategize, right? And for us, again, in the middle of a global pandemic, right, we had this huge win, and in 2020 passing this first piece of legislation, which is Assembly Bill 2218, right? You know we never close our doors, right? Like most trans people didn't get the stimulus benefit that most people got. Why? Because most trans people are not working, right? And so, so there's so many different layers of like the institutional violence that we experience even before the Trump era, right? And so for us, it's really, how do we continue to like just fight the power that continues to marginalize us and that continues to oppress us and that continues to keep us at the bottom of the totem pole. So, for us, really, it's about empowering our own people for us to continue to live and exist and live the lives that we are destined to live.
And that's I think, a good way to wrap that question. Thank you so much for sharing that, Bambi, and all of you for sharing just what the last couple of years and beyond have been like. We have one question. We're going to answer it a little differently because I think it's one that is a great conversation starter, and I guess at some points an end. But it's how should we be looking at and using gender-neutral language, like Latinx, when studies show very few Latino people use the term? So this is an ongoing conversation that we've seen all over social media. So what we're gonna do is I invite JP, David, and Bambi. I'll post it on mine, the question, as well as a link to the Cultural Competency Guide, which offers some really great recommendations. But if you can jump in and answer that question there, and everyone who's joining us, feel free to jump in and also share your insights. I think that's something important that we should keep talking about as a community. And so with that, we're gonna wrap. Thank you so much to everyone that joined us, and a special thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the work that you do and for the insight that you've provided today. I look forward to seeing all the work that you have coming up, and everyone enjoy the rest of NHJ 2021.
Everyone.
Bye. Hasta luego. Besos y abrazos.